Hello everyone, my name is Josh Hughes and thank you very much for joining my presentation. Today I will be discussing sport and its role in national identity formation in the Kyrgyz Republic. Specifically, my paper in this presentation further proposed the national identity theoretical framework of ethno-symbolism in the analysis of Kyrgyz sporting nationalism. This paper was originally written as the final research project for Sociology 1111, a course I took in the spring 2025 semester with Professor Isabelle Jajone at Harvard University, where I study as a master's student focusing on Central Asian Studies in the Davis Center for Eurasian Studies. To quickly highlight the presentation structure and outline, I will begin with an introduction to the topic in Kyrgyz sports before reviewing broader debates around theories of national identity. Next, to help give a concrete picture of how ethno-symbolic nationalism may look in practice, I quickly highlight examples in broader Kyrgyz culture that also help give context to examples found in the next section, which focuses specifically on Kyrgyz sporting ethno-symbolism. So, to give a brief and rather broad introduction to Kyrgyzstan for those unfamiliar, the country is located in Central Asia on China's western border, to the south of Russia, east of the Middle East, and north of South Asia. Despite being surrounded by large and powerful neighbors, it is a relatively small, lower middle income country of roughly 7.5 million people. In the late 19th century, Russian imperial expansion into Central Asia saw the then predominantly nomadic Kyrgyz come under Russian subjugation, and following revolution and civil war in the 1910s and 20s, this of course became the Soviet Union. During the nearly 70 years under the Soviet Union, the legal territorial boundaries of modern Kyrgyzstan were established. Many nomads were forced to settle in cities or on collective farms, and Soviet-Russian influence left a number of indelible legacies, including linguistically and culturally, as well as, unfortunately, a legacy of political instability and corruption. Since gaining its independence in 1991, Kyrgyzstan has been the site of 3 coups or revolutions, the most recent of which was in 2020. That said, it is a country that in recent years has seen rapid economic growth, with many large infrastructure projects underway across the country. Turning now to its sport, Kyrgyzstan has very diversified interests. Of course, as a truly global game, football is among the most popular sports, and recent years have seen much investment in the country's national team and domestic club league. Fighting sports like boxing, wrestling, and martial arts are also extremely popular, particularly among the younger population, and Kyrgyz fighters across the spectrum have seen great success in international competitions. However, stemming from the country's nomadic history that culturally survived the Soviet Union's attempts to erase it, a number of nomadic sports are played in Kyrgyzstan, often taking the form of equestrian or wrestling games. In 2014, Kyrgyzstan organized and held the first edition of the World Nomad Games, a biennial Olympic-style international sporting event featuring many of these nomadic sports. This presentation will explore how Kyrgyz sports, especially those played at the World Nomad Games, act as state-sponsored sites that reflect, reinforce, and reinvent the idea of what it means to be Kyrgyz through the use of symbols, shared historical myths, and traditions. Broader debates of national identity theories are first examined. An essential goal of this research is the advancement of ethno-symbolism as a lens for the study of sporting nationalism in the Kyrgyz context. Examining the World Nomad Games through this framework provides greater insight into the role that sports play in national identity formation and performance, as well as the mechanisms by which the Kyrgyz state interprets and implements its formation using its cultural heritage. For many, I know that this theoretical overview will seem rather simplistic, and those well-versed in the topic are welcome to advance to the next section. However, it is nonetheless necessary to situate ethno-symbolism in the broader field of nationalism studies, especially given the fact that it emerged as a sort of reaction to modernism and primordialism. Looking specifically at writings on sporting nationalism, much of the literature is grounded in what can broadly be classified as the modernist framework. Eric Hobsbawm, who in 1983, along with Terence Ranger, popularized the idea of the invented tradition, made the now famous quip that, quote, "the imagined community of millions seems more real as a team of 11 named people." This is, of course, in reference to fellow modernist Benedict Anderson's 1983 work on imagined communities, which, very broadly summarizing, suggested that the rise in technological innovations, specifically the printing press and mass print media, worked to unite vast, heretofore disjointed communities around a common literary culture. Such an idea has been applied to the way that national sport and its dissemination across television and radio have contributed to national identity by a variety of scholars. Other modernist ideas frequently invoked include Durkheim's collective effervescence, the highly charged and emotional feeling of unity and transcendence felt in a moment of collective excitement. Though Durkheim's works did not explicitly focus on sporting events as an example of this, the parallels are obvious, and works on sports sociology have frequently focused on the ability of these events and the rituals present within them to contribute to group identity formation, both locally and nationally. On the other hand, on the other end of the national identity spectrum, if you will, lies primordialism. Less frequently used in sporting nationalism specifically, understanding its philosophical and theoretical perspectives is necessary to understanding ethno-symbolism. Championed by scholars like Schills and Geertz, primordialism focuses on the role of kinship, blood ties, and the inevitability of the connections among individuals of the same background throughout time. Rather than national connections being invented, constructed, or imagined, Schills in 1957 succinctly summarized primordialism, writing, quote, "The attachment to another member of one's kinship group is not just a function of interaction, it is because a certain ineffable significance is attributed to the tie of blood." In attempting to bridge the gap between the often criticized essentialist tendencies of primordialism and the instrumentality of modernism, Anthony Smith, along with scholars like John Hutchinson and John Armstrong, though this project primarily relies on Smith's works, proposed the national identity framework of ethno-symbolism. For better understanding of ethno-symbolism, it is useful to first look at how it relates to and distinguishes itself from primordialism and modernism, what Smith calls the two extremes of nationalism theory. Ethno-symbolism can be viewed as a kind of middle ground between the two. In Smith's own analysis, ethno-symbolism agrees with modernism in a number of areas. Both believe that nations exist as real sociological communities, that these real communities are meaningful sites of action and passion for their inhabitants, and that nations and nationalist affiliations exist in a specific space and time that are used as, quote, resources and vehicles for their own interests and visions, an argument made popular by Brubaker and others. However, it is at this point that Smith in 2009 then claims that ethno-symbolists diverge from modernist thinkers, critiquing the modernist tendency to overinflate materiality over symbolism, paying too strict attention to the literal modern or post-17th century time period, focusing too heavily on elitist top-down representations, and paying too little attention to, or outright ignoring, the ethnic makeup and foundation of many nations and the importance of internal and external national conflicts. These critiques are wide-ranging, and though Smith and proponents of ethno-symbolism are often viewed as more sympathetic to primordialism than modernism, there are certainly many exceptions taken with primordialism that are worth noting. One of the more compelling critiques that gets at the heart of primordial theorizing focuses on the writings of Geertz, who in 1973 suggested that ethnic groups, especially in a post-colonial context, were held together by the inherent givens of language, race, and religion, going so far as to assert, quote, "One is bound to one's kinsman, one's neighbor, one's fellow believer, ipso facto, at least in great part by virtue of some unaccountable absolute import attributed to the very tie itself." In response, Smith in 1998 questions the explanatory power of such an idea with regard to the formation and role of nations and the ideology of nationalism, calling Geertz's and others' view of these phenomena as historical givens, quote, "no more than an interesting tautology." At this point, you might say, fine, ethno-symbolism disagrees with both modernism and primordialism, but what does it self-propose? First, Smith in 1991 defined the nation as, quote, "a named human population sharing an historic territory, common myths and historical memories, a mass public culture, a common economy, and common legal rights for all members." The ethnic community, or what Smith terms as the ethne, is seen as the foundation of the nation, with attributes that include, here's a long quote, 1, a collective proper name, 2, a myth of common ancestry, 3, shared historical memories, 4, one or more differentiating elements of common culture, 5, an association with a specific homeland, and 6, a sense of solidarity for significant sectors of the population. However, in distinction from the primordialist view, these attributes are both subjective and, from a historical perspective, often mythical, and thus far from inevitable in the essentialist idea. Furthermore, ethno-symbolism does not dispute that nations and nationalisms are constructed and are, by and large, modern inventions, at least in the way they are commonly understood. However, as the second part of the hyphenated name implies, these constructions are rooted in the historical memory, mythical or not, and symbolism of the ethnic communities, giving them both meaning and distinction. Smith in 2009 writes, "Too often, modernist analyses identify the structural conditions that encourage the rise of nations and/or nationalisms, but stop short of saying anything about the content of nationalist ideologies and movements or the distinctive shape of nations, or indeed which are the populations or groups that are likely to emerge as modern nations. To address these questions, we have to try to gauge the appeal of different motifs, myths, memories, symbols, values, and the like, to various strata of the population, and the reasons for this affinity in terms not only of their material interests and needs, but also of their visions and aspirations, the familiarity of concepts employed, folk traditions, customs, and the like." End quote. Therefore, in the view of Smith and ethno-symbolists, the nation may be both modern in its construction and tied to the past, but not in a rigid, inevitable, or natural way, with attachments and affinities to the nation being the product not purely of elite invention, but rather forming around the invocation of shared cultural symbols and myths. For posterity's sake, it's worth noting that Smith has often faced criticism for the conflation of the terms ethnic group, nation, and state. Addressing such semantic considerations fell outside the scope of my paper, but Hutchinson and Gibbernow in 2004 discussed this and a number of other critiques and clarifications of ethno-symbolism. In the interest of time and to avoid redundancy for this presentation, I will skip the next section of the paper that reviews the literature of ethno-symbolism's application to sport. However, Alan Banner's 2001 book, Sport, Nationalism, and Globalization, Wigham's 2023 article on the Scottish Highland Games and national sports, and Fabian's 2023 chapter on the revival of traditional games in the Turco-Persian world offer great insights for those interested in further reading. Now, to offer tangible examples that support the ethno-symbolic framework, because I know the previous theoretical section can seem quite abstract, I will highlight some prominent non-sporting features in the Kyrgyz context that will help both to clarify how ethno-symbolism looks in practice and provide greater context for Kyrgyzstan and its sport. First, it's important to note that the modern territorial boundaries of Kyrgyzstan and our contemporary conception of a unified Kyrgyz state is largely due to the rather arbitrary delineations imposed by early Soviet leaders like Joseph Stalin in his role as Commissar of Nationalities. For centuries, the land was inhabited by both sedentary and nomadic Kyrgyz tribes, and while the 70 years of Soviet rule brought rapid development, industrialization, and modernization, it also led to forced sedentarization of nomads, forced collectivization of land, cultural Russification, and a lack of political autonomy. Nevertheless, at times, the center in Moscow actively promoted the national consciousness of its minority ethnic groups through a process of nativization or indigenization, korenizatsiya in Russian, leading some scholars like Terry Martin and Ronald Suney to designate the USSR as an affirmative action empire. One of the most prominent aspects of this was the promotion of writers and literary figures like Alisher Navai in Uzbekistan and Rudaki in Tajikistan as founding fathers of the national republics. The Kyrgyz analog for this is the Epic of Manas, a lengthy epic poem detailing the ancient quasi-mythical conquests of the eponymous leader that was passed down orally through generations by Manas Chi, who melodically performed sections of the epic from memory. During the late Russian Empire and early Soviet period, attempts were made to write down the epic from transcriptions of performances by Manas Chi like Sagam by Orzbekov and Saik by Karolayev, the latter of which is today featured on the 500 som banknote. Manas became a verifiable symbol of Kyrgyz autonomy and ancient mythical strength, what van der Heide called, quote, the perfect symbol for independent Kyrgyzstan, around which a 1995 celebration was staged in honor of the supposed 1,000-year anniversary of the epic that was, quote, taken as an opportunity to strengthen Kyrgyz unity and to introduce the Republic's new identity to the world, end quote. Manas's symbolic presence around the country continues today, including two prominent statues in the capital Bishkek on the main Alato Square and a second around a kilometer away in front of the National Philharmonic Hall. Michel Lamont describes symbolic boundaries as the, quote, distinctions that we make to categorize objects, people, and practices that help differentiate at its most basic what constitutes us versus what constitutes them, the other. Graham Smith et al. In 1998 applied this idea of symbolic boundary drawing to the newly independent states' approach to desovietization, which they write, quote, refers to the way in which nationalizing political elites have been keen to remove the symbols, political institutions, and representatives of Soviet power from the social and political landscape, and to replace them with new national symbols, political institutions, and social practices in order to safeguard what is claimed as the national interest against the colonial other. Manas serves a great example for describing the ethno-symbolic approach to national identity. A shared cultural myth known by everyone in the country, it's quite hard to miss, which became a symbol of Kyrgyz strength, independence, and identity itself, especially vis-à-vis its former colonizers in Russia. Kyrgyzstan has a number of additional important national ethno-symbols that deserve a more focused look, for which time constraints unfortunately do not afford a more in-depth survey. These include the natural mountainous symbolism invoked in the national anthem and state seal, the symbolic centrality of the Kyrgyz language as opposed to Russian, and the state flag. If you look closely at the flag featured in the photo, you'll see a tunduk surrounded by 40 rays. The 40 rays signify the unity of the 40 Kyrgyz tribes into one nation, while the tunduk is the cross pattern formed at the roof of a yurt, the Kyrgyz nomadic dwelling. The tunduk will be important later in this presentation, but now at long last we turn to Kyrgyz sports. A common theme in the literature on ethno-symbolic sporting nationalism is analyzing the intersection of sport, cultural heritage, and nation building through the playing and revival of a nation's national games, which are thought to reveal a more authentic foundation of society. Such traditional national games in Kyrgyzstan often go by the catch-all title of nomadic games and play a central role in Kyrgyz culture. While the practice of nomadic games survived the Soviet Union's policies of forced heteronization and anti-nomadic modernizing pushes, the games and their traditions became endangered, leading to nationwide efforts to revitalize and safeguard the games following Kyrgyzstan's independence in 1991. Further incentivized by years of political instability in the country, including two revolutions in 2005 and 2010, and specifically the ethnic violence in the wake of the latter revolution, in the mid-2010s, the Kyrgyz government, spearheaded by President Almazbek Atambayev, created the World Nomad Games. These international Olympic-style events, according to Shiranova in 2021, played the dual role of promoting ethno-sport and giving Kyrgyzstan a new national brand and a new country image following the bloody instability. While much recent research has focused on the role of sports washing and image control through hosting international events, the central focus of this paper is on the symbols, rituals, and meanings present in the World Nomad Games, their effects on nationalist belonging in Kyrgyzstan, and the role of historical memory in national identity formation. A lot can be learned from the types of games played in these events, and though not exhaustive, I broadly classify them into three groups: equestrian sports, wrestling, and component-based games. Given Kyrgyzstan's history of nomadism and its mountainous terrain, it is no surprise that horses were, and continue to be, an essential part of cultural and practical life. The horse's ubiquity in Kyrgyzstan is perceived exogenously and endogenously, with horse trekking, quote, frequently promoted in tourism as the most authentic way of experiencing Kyrgyzstan. The same equestrian-centered authenticity can be given to the country's sport, with prominent games including kokburu, in which riders attempt to throw the ulak, a goat or sheep carcass, into the opponent's goal, a tai kazan. Various types of horse racing, including at shabush, kunan shabush, and jorgo salish, which primarily differ in the length, prestige, and allowed gait of the races, and horseback archery or other forms of mounted hunting. As with many ethnic or national games, the practices can be read as modern reinterpretations of ancient rituals, providing tangible links to Kyrgyzstan's nomadic past that was disrupted by colonization and modernization. For example, on the official website of the Third World Nomad Games in 2018, kokburu is described as having, quote, its origins in the distant past, from a time when men went to go hunt for prey to feed their families. The impact of nomadic games on contemporary Kyrgyz society is seen not just in its socio-cultural values, but also in the contemporary sports realm. The sport of kurush, or Kyrgyz kurush, is described as having its roots in training, quote, valiant heroes who represented their nation and defended its honor during military campaigns. And given the number of legends, parables, and historical sources that reference wrestlers, quote, wrestling itself has become part of traditional culture and still has influence today. Quote. Indeed, modern styles of wrestling, like freestyle or Greco-Roman, are among the most popular sports in Kyrgyzstan, and wrestlers like Aksel Makhmudov, Aysu Tinibekova, and Jolaman Sarshinbekov have enjoyed consistent success at the Olympic Games and World Championships. Likewise, Alush, a form of belt wrestling, is described by United World Wrestling, wrestling's international governing body, as, quote, one of the most ancient sports of Asia and the national traditional sport of Kyrgyzstan. Such a level of wrestling pedigree acknowledged by the sport's highest bureaucratic organization is significant in itself, but more importantly, Alush and Kurush offer prime sporting examples of the connection between the ethno-symbolists, analysts of shared pre-modern mythical histories, taking ancient wrestling's prominence in the Epic of Manas, for example, and its modern usage in national definition. A common theme across Kyrgyzstan's nomadic sports, pre-modern military strength is the foundation of the component-based games as well. Ordo, a game similar in technique to dice shooting but using a sheep or goat's ankle bone, is described as, quote, a kind of military map which warriors use to learn how to defeat an enemy. A circle drawn on the ground represented the state's territory, and rivals used this to work out the plan of battle. Likewise, Togo's Kurgol, a game similar to Mancala, was originally meant to develop strategic military thinking for warriors and soldiers. Insofar as the games are an expression of the foundation of national identity elements, the explicit invocation of masculine strength, a warrior ethos, and social patriarchy and paternalism must also be acknowledged. Indeed, the official description of Togo's Kurgol reads, in Togo's Kurgol, each player leaves one stone in the starting well during each play. This is a reflection of the idea of saving the paternal center of social life of nomadic Turkic people. Continuing with the theme of paternalism, it is worth noting that women occupy an unequal role in the World Nomad Games competitions. While women are permitted to compete in Togo's Kurgol, as well as Ordo, Alish, and horseback archery, they traditionally do not compete in arguably the most impactful game of Kokburu and the majority of the other events. At the same time, as Kim and Molchanova in 2019 analyzed, the game Kyrgyz is not included as a World Nomad Games sport, despite the fact that, quote, no educational, professional, and formal sources leave out Kyrgyz in the description of Kyrgyzstan's culture, history, and touristic attractiveness. Kyrgyz, which literally translates as girl chasing, is a game played between a man and a woman, in which the male rider tries to catch up to his opponent and is rewarded with a kiss, but if he is not able to catch the female rider within a specified time or distance, he is then pursued and punished with a strike from the female rider's whip. The game is a veritable cornerstone of Kyrgyz sport and game culture, and despite the patriarchal undertones of the sport, it is one in which women are inherently required to occupy an equal athletic position, and also comes with the potential for the female rider to publicly embarrass her male counterpart. Their symbolic erasure from the World Nomad Games, an event explicitly created to strengthen new independent ideologies, themes, and values, like highlighting patriarchal features, in order to convey the new meaning and structure of post-Soviet sovereign Kyrgyzstan, only reinforces the projection of women as, quote, peripheral, decorative, and reduced. Feminism and the struggle for women's equality, as with all societies, is an ongoing process in Kyrgyzstan. This June 2025 has seen an explosion of discourse around women's equality and rights in the country. I bring this example up not to make a normative statement on Kyrgyz culture and the role of women here, but rather to illustrate that while sport promotes one idea or version of identity in the country that may be more traditional, other sectors are actively working for greater inclusion. Aside from the content and symbolism of the games themselves, as Fabian's 2023 analysis indicated, the question of ownership of games acquires an added intensity due to their foundational role in identity formation through alleged shared historical ritual. The ownership of the nomadic sports and the World Nomad Games themselves has a similarly interesting quality. The first three editions of the World Nomad Games in 2014, 2016, and 2018 were held in Kyrgyzstan, and according to Sharanov's 2021 research, Kyrgyz Minister of Culture Sultan Rayev and Deputy Head of the President's Apparatus Sapar Isakov considered the World Nomad Games to be an event that should only be hosted by Kyrgyzstan. Nevertheless, after the COVID-related cancellations in 2020, the fourth World Nomad Games were hosted in Iznik, Turkey in 2022, while the fifth World Nomad Games were held in Astana, Kazakhstan in 2024. The gold medal match of Kokpar between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan on September 12th of the 2024 Astana Games provides a key example of the tensions surrounding the game's ownership. Kokpar is the Kazakh version of Kokburu, but played with a dummy rather than a real carcass, and with goals on the ground rather than in the 3-meter bucket of the Kyrgyz Tai Kazan. In a dramatic come-from-behind performance, the Kazakh side bested the Kyrgyz by a score of 5-4, a match during which a fight between the sides broke out at the end of the first half when Kyrgyz player Kurbanechbek Sultanoglu was hit twice in the face by a Kazakh whip, or kamcha, a penalty in the sport. Following the loss, the Kyrgyz side protested the match, claiming that the play was not fair. After nearly boycotting the medal ceremony, quote, Kyrgyz team manager Erlan Abdukaparov said Kazakh national security officials had requested his team not to sow discord between the two nations. Though the Kyrgyz team did attend to receive their silver medal, they left the podium in protest before the Kazakh team received their gold and before the playing of the Kazakh national anthem. This scandal led to flared tempers and fights on social media between Kyrgyz and Kazakh fans of the sport. prompting parliament member and president of the Kazakh Kokpar Federation, Aydarбек Hojanazarov, to clarify on social media that the results of the match were final and further criticize the Kyrgyz players for their actions after the match. This in turn led the Kyrgyz side to offer a rematch, quote, for the will of friendship between the two nations, in response to which Hojanazarov declined by stating, quote, if you are afraid of a Kamcha hit, then do not play Kokpar, and that, quote, this is Kokpar, not ballet. Just as tensions began to die down 2 weeks later, director of the Astana Games, Nail Norov, publicly stated his opinion that, quote, the Nomad Games are basically entirely thought of by us, the Kazakhs, which led to reignited tensions online. The relationship was becoming so strained that the Kazakh Ministry of Foreign Affairs had to make a statement calling Kyrgyzstan a brotherly country and affirming that the sports dispute was not affecting the political relationship of the countries. From the outside, what appeared to simply be a petty squabble over the final outcome of a sports match had real impacts on Kyrgyz as well as Kazakh culture and identity formation. The spat caused Kyrgyz commenters to begin drawing symbolic boundaries between their practices and those of the Kazakhs, with the manliness and authenticity of Kyrgyz Kokburu and the Kazakh Kokpar compared in light of their slight rule variations and the debate over using a real or dummy ulak. Finally, it's worth noting that in the Kokburu final played the following day, the Kyrgyz side bested the Kazakhs to win the gold in their national sport. Although this is not in my paper, since returning to Kyrgyzstan at the beginning of June 2025, I have spoken to many individuals about the Kokpar final match. Though people here still seem put off by the match, particularly with accusations that the Kazakhs did not play fairly and calling claims of Kazakh ownership of the World Nomad Games preposterous, the common conclusion is that the two countries share a deep and rich brotherly history. However, nearly everyone I've spoken to has playfully made the comment that Kyrgyz Kokburu is the real or better version of the game because it is more difficult and uses a real ulak. The comments on screen highlight some of the common reactions. Good-natured and taken humorously, but the point illustrates the boundaries drawn between the two countries thanks to the games. Though the main focus of Kyrgyz sporting ethno-symbolism is on its nomadic games, I would like to now highlight a handful of examples that relate to modern sport as well, focusing specifically on football. So, notably, upon the conclusion of the Astana Games, then Kyrgyz Minister of Culture Altanbek Maksutov announced that the 6th World Nomad Games in 2026 would be returning to Kyrgyzstan, reasserting Kyrgyz ownership of the World Nomad Games at a time when the sporting scene is rapidly developing in the country. Most visibly, this development is happening around physical sporting infrastructure, constructing and updating stadiums primarily designed to host football matches for the blossoming Kyrgyz Professional Football League. At the recent opening of the 2,500-seat Dostok or Friendship Arena in the village of Beshkungoy, the new home of the Premier League team Talant FC, President Sadir Japarov applauded the first stadium in independent Kyrgyzstan to be built entirely from scratch and noted that 17 stadiums in the country are under renovation or construction, to which about 5.4 billion som, or $62 million has been allocated. For reference, Kyrgyzstan's total state budget for the year 2025 is 430.2 billion som, or $4.65 billion, which would imply roughly 1.3% of the annual budget being spent on stadium renovation or construction. The most impressive of these stadiums is Bishkek Arena, projected to be completed by Kyrgyz Independence Day on August 31st, 2026, at which point it will become the largest stadium in the region with a capacity of 51,000 seats and serve as the home for the Kyrgyz national team. Such a monumental statement of post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan's economic, cultural, and sporting development is not without its national symbolism. The stadium is being built to resemble a yurt, complete with a lattice framework exterior and a roof that will resemble the aforementioned tunduk. President Japarov shared images of the stadium's rendering along with the message that, quote, the stadium design is based on an important part of Kyrgyz culture, the phenomenon of the yurt. Bishkek Arena, like the World Nomad Games, constitutes an enormous state-driven project that will become a physical representation of the country both domestically and internationally. More than just a creative design choice, much can be read from the decision for the stadium to resemble a yurt, including celebrating the revival of contemporary nomadic practices and asserting the connection with Kyrgyzstan's pre-modern identity in an inherently modern structure. Beyond just stadium infrastructure, football symbolisms are further localized to the Kyrgyz context, creating deeper domestic meanings and attachments in a global sport. For example, the players and fans of the national football team are collectively known as Akshum Karlar, the White Falcons, a reference to the hunting bird used by Manas in the national epic, which also prominently features on the Kyrgyz state seal. Similarly, the away jerseys of the national team are inspired by the White Falcon's title, featuring a pattern reminiscent of the outlines of wings, while the home kits feature Kyrgyz national patterns that represent man and falcon. Though brief, these observations provide further examples of ethno-symbolic nationalist elements in Kyrgyz sports, showing that this phenomenon is not limited to nomadic games. So, Kyrgyz sport, especially, though certainly not exclusively, the forms of national nomadic sports played at the World Nomad Games, provides a tangible medium through which to observe the performance of national identity. Though many of the rituals and practices are the product of recent and often state-sponsored initiatives, the analysis shows that they do not fit the idea of invented traditions in the modernist framework, but rather closely resemble reinterpretations of traditions and customs that date back centuries, well before the conception of a Kyrgyz nation. These ties are not natural, inevitable, or even always historically factual, as the primordialist perspective would support, but the attention to la longue durée, as well as the explicit grounding of reimagined cultural symbolism around the dominant ethnic community, or ethni, provides compelling rationale for employing the ethno-symbolist framework of analysis. Beyond just yielding interesting theoretical considerations, the values reflected in these sports offer insights into the forms of identities that are reinforced. Central themes include patriarchal, paternalist, and warrior motifs, even in the non-physical games. Close ties with and reverence for shared cultural history through the symbolic use of myth and tradition, and markers that create symbolic boundaries between the ethnic Kyrgyz aspect of the nation and their surrounding ethno-national identities, both domestically, like in the case of Russians and Uzbeks, and abroad, seen in the example with the neighboring Kazakhs. More broadly, the choice of rooting state-sponsored projects in ancient cultural symbolism, like the World Nomad Games themselves and the design of Bishkek Arena, is significant in revealing the Kyrgyz state's goal of national identity promotion. Given the predominantly international character of both the World Nomad Games and the national football team stadium, the implications affect both domestic and global understandings of Kyrgyzness. Such examples show that sport not only reflects Kyrgyz national identity, but plays an active role in its formation. However, it is necessary to note that in a topic as broad and subjective as national identity, there is not one all-encompassing definition or description that satisfactorily covers the inherent diversity of the modern nation-state. National identity is, after all, simply an ideal type to be used for analytical purposes, and further, only one of a number of personal competing identities like race, ethnicity, gender, and class. Currently in Kyrgyzstan, the government is implementing a policy called Kyrgyzstan, aimed at strengthening civic national identity in the country by promoting involvement with and building trust among local and national government apparatuses, bolstering the quantity and quality of Kyrgyz language speakers, and promoting gender, ethnic, and religious tolerance and equality. Furthermore, it goes without saying that every Kyrgyz citizen obviously does not identify and engage with sports to the same degree. Thus, the ethno-symbolic nationalism promoted through sports represents only a part of a larger whole of both the personal interpretations of national identity as well as the state goals of its promotion. An important avenue of further research should explore the complementary and contradictory aspects of this multi-pronged approach, particularly implementing ethnographic perspectives that reveal the salience of the differing perspectives. I am currently located in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan for the summer, studying Kyrgyz language and conducting research for my master's thesis, which hopes to explore a similar topic while incorporating further first-hand input from Kyrgyz citizens, sports fans, and government officials. Nevertheless, even in its limited scope, the analysis of Kyrgyz sporting nationalism shows relevant findings for the study of Kyrgyz identity and post-Soviet nation-building more broadly. The visibility and publicity of sporting investment in Kyrgyzstan in recent years have made sports a central site for the symbolic reproduction of cultural values and history. The recent Division III IIHF Hockey World Championship, consistent international wrestling success, the return of the World Nomad Games to Kyrgyzstan in 2026, and the national football team's advancement to the third round of the World Cup qualifying stages for the first time have all contributed to sports' increasing domestic popularity. At the same time, national ethno-symbolic signifiers like Kyrgyzstan's flag, seal, and national anthem have seen changes in recent years, indicating that President Japarov and his government understand the importance of national symbolism. Thus, this fact, combined with the increases in investment and interest in sports, suggests that the development of sporting nationalism in Kyrgyzstan will continue in the coming years. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much to everyone that joined. I look forward to joining in discussion, hearing critiques, and answering questions in the discussion board. Thank you.